What's up, everybody? I'm Sega Lord X, and in this episode, we are going to take a look at a bunch of Sega Saturn ports. All of these games came from other hardware. Now, I tried to give you a good mix of games this time. I tried to cover a bunch of genres. I tried to cover games that you may be interested in. Were they any good? What were they like? What was the content? So, let's take a look at these ports to the Sega Saturn. Contra Legacy of War was quite the controversial game among my friends in 1996. A few loved the run-and-gun overhead style, a few hated it. I'd hold out for the Saturn version the following year, and you know what? There were no mixed feelings with me. I straight up didn't like it. The narrow view of the overhead perspective meant you took damage at times due to things being slightly off screen that you couldn't see. The graphics were drab and didn't have a lot of detail. It just didn't feel like Contra. There had been multiple Contra games during the 16-bit era that were awesome, and Konami ditching the side-scrolling style that was synonymous with the classic run-and-gun franchise was a huge mistake in my opinion. Konami outsourced this one to Appaloosa Interactive, and in a rare turn of events, this game was never released in Japan. Likewise, the Saturn version of the game benefited heavily for its later release, as it ran favorably in comparison to its PS1 counterpart. Although I have a fairly negative opinion of this game, I would still give it a run if you like this style. There are not too many games of this type on the system, and if you put some time into it to adjust to the new perspective, I'm sure there is still some fun to be had here. Alien Trilogy would land on the Saturn half a year after the PS1 version. It was an amalgamation of the first 3 Alien films, cut and spliced together to form one central story. You are Ripley, the lone survivor of a team of Marines wiped out by the alien horde. You must battle your way through an infested colony, a desolate prison facility, and then the alien ship itself. This was my first Aliens experience that truly brought the terror of the films home, especially the sound effects. Exploring its dark halls only to hear the motion tracker start tingling meant either a facehugger or a xenomorph was just around the corner ready to strike, adding a movie quality to its experience. This would not be matched by its graphics, however. Many areas are repeated to the point of nauseam, and there is little separating one corridor from the next. The game does play smoothly, however, and runs at a decent enough frame rate. Overall, Alien Trilogy is one of the better FPSs on the Saturn. It won't knock Duke Nukem 3D off its perch, but at its affordable price, it's a damn decent pickup even today. Unlike its Mortal Kombat 2 port, I can recommend this acclaimed game without reservation. Much like Toshinden, Destruction Derby is a game that did more harm than good for the Sega Saturn. Once again, the game would receive an inferior port, and this time it was so glaringly obvious the Saturn version was the weaker port, it would make some wonder whether the two machines were part of the same generation. The PS1 game had been smooth, had great transparencies, and awesome effects when the cars smashed into one another. The Saturn version runs like ass, looks like ass, and has pop-up in areas that are enclosed. In the circle arena for the Destruction Derby itself, one side of the arena will pop in and out as you drive. The crash effects and transparencies take a huge hit here as well. When cars smack into one another in the Saturn version, you barely get any pieces flying off at all, and the smoke effects are these horrible, screen-marring pixels that obscure the action. This game does retain some of the more fun traits of the PS1 version though. Crashing into cars never gets old, and the race mode can be absolute chaos on the tracks with cross sections. Make no mistake, however, this game is light years better on the PS1 in just about every single way. Even at its cheap asking price for the Japanese version, I'd have a hard time recommending it. It's not doom bad as far as ports go, but it's pretty damn rough nonetheless. Based on Radmobile, the Sega System 32 arcade game from AM2, Gale Racer hit the Saturn right around the Japanese launch. I had such high hopes for it too. The arcade had released nearly 4 years prior. Surely the Saturn could give us an arcade-perfect port, right? Wrong. Whatever happened here, Gale Racer failed on nearly every level to replicate the awesome arcade version. It didn't run as well. The draw-in was closer. The effects were less impressive, and someone at Sega thought it'd be a good idea to put polygonal cars in the game, which managed to stick out like a sore thumb in the otherwise 2D log scaling engine. The game has its fun moments, but has aged poorly for the most part. It isn't easy either, sporting a difficulty that on its own can be rough, but is made worse by poor collision detection and cheap crashes. It remains cheap, however, and may be worth a look if you remember the arcade fondly. Otherwise, skip it, especially since the Saturn has other games like Sega Rally that easily destroy it. Originally released on the 3DO, Gex would make a much appreciated appearance on the Sega Saturn in 1996. Traditional 2D platformers virtually disappeared during the 32-bit generation, and the Saturn took it especially hard, as it lacked even a new Sonic game to fill the void. Gex would be cleaned up for the Saturn, allowing a better variety of wisecracking quotes from the main character, smoother, more accurate platforming, and better overall graphics. You take on the role of Gex, a pop culture quote-spewing gecko lizard trying to escape the clutches of the evil Rez. You'll run, jump, and climb through various themed worlds such as a cemetery, Toonville, Jungle Isle, and Kung Fu-ville. Gain access to the final world and defeat the evil Rez for good. Gex is a very solid playing platformer, offers a strong challenge, and is worth its relatively cheap asking price. I enjoyed the game on the 3DO and thought it was even better here. The only negative I can plant on this game is that the one-liners from Gex get old by the end of the first world. They are repeated often, but luckily you can turn them off in the options. Gex certainly won't make you forget Sonic Extreme was cancelled on the Saturn, but it's a great platformer all the same. Irem Arcade Classics was released for the Japanese Saturn in 1996. It's a compilation of the old arcade games, Kung Fu Master, Zippy Race, and 10-Yard Fight. You may remember Kung Fu Master from the NES, where it was titled simply Kung Fu. Battle your way through 5 levels, punching and kicking various thugs until you meet the bosses of each stage. Zippy Race is a simplistic overhead racing game that is brutally difficult. 10-Yard Fight is a throwback American football game that is simple to play, but still maintains some fun if you like the arcade original. This compilation runs around $30 to $40 on eBay, and although Kung Fu Master and 10-Yard Fight can still be fun, this package should be half that price. Even if you love these games as a kid, a simple evening's attention is all any of these games will give you. They quite frankly do not have the depth to demand any more than that. Grab the original NES version of Kung Fu for a $5 and call it a day. This set of games can still be fun, but much better games can be bought at its current price point. Mortal Kombat 2 on the Saturn is one of the most disappointing ports I've ever played. Landing nearly 3 years after the arcade version on which it's based, the Saturn version was a disappointment from the moment I hit the start button. The game is missing sound effects everywhere. There's slowdown during gameplay and fatalities. Shang Tsung is virtually unplayable due to needing to load every time he morphs. The music was altered and changed. What little sound effects remained were changed as well. The AI was drastically reprogrammed and is now both harder and easier at the same time. Certain moves could be spammed over and over, catching the CPU AI every single time, while trying to mix things up often meant being destroyed by an overly aggressive opponent. Everything about this port just felt wrong. The game was 3 years old on a vastly superior piece of hardware. It should have been perfect. Every sound and music piece should have been there and better than ever. The gameplay should have been super smooth and free of any slowdown. The only areas this game shined were the graphics and animation. It did look just like the arcade game. It had massive sprites and great color use. The backgrounds were detailed and scrolled smoothly. But there were just too many other problems that would crush this game in the end. The Super Nintendo version of this game murders it in everything but the graphics. And that is a sad, sad admission. Stay away from this massive disappointment.
Fatality.
I enjoyed Offworld Interceptor when it was released on the 3DO. It was sort of an off-road racing game mixed with car combat gameplay. It wasn't anything special, but it was mindlessly addictive. So when the game hit the Saturn the following year, I picked it up just to see how much better my Saturn would run it. To my utter disappointment, the game was only slightly better in regards to frame rate and little else. The game looked nearly identical otherwise, and featured no improvements in gameplay or content. Drop onto one of 6 worlds and try and survive to the finish line. That is all you do. No added detail or flair to the graphics. No extra content to deepen the experience. Offworld Interceptor Extreme is a cheap game for the Saturn these days, and rightfully so. This kind of mindless and mundane experience is hard to stomach these days. There is nothing here that warrants your time or energy anymore. Grab it to complete your collection, but otherwise don't waste your time. Tetris Plus was originally developed by Natsume and published by Jellicoe for the Japanese arcade in 1996. It was ported to the Saturn later that year and ended up being a damn good puzzle game for the system. The game consists of classic Tetris mode, a new puzzle mode, and a 2-player versus puzzle mode. Puzzle mode is essentially a rescue mission, where you try and break blocks until the little explorer safely exits the level. This is true with the versus mode as well, where both players race to be the first to rescue their explorer. The game is packed with tons of levels, bright, colorful graphics, and great replay value. This is one of the better puzzle games of the era, and I highly recommend it. My daughter loves it and gets a kick out of its versus mode. A great one to play with the wife or girlfriend as well. It's also cheap in Japanese form and completely playable. When Battle Arena Toshinden hit the PS1 at launch, it was lauded as a killer app that showed up Virtua Fighter in nearly every single way. It certainly looked the part, but I always felt the game was shallow as hell and didn't even come close to Virtua Fighter's playability. This didn't stop Sega from swinging from Sony's sack and wanting the Saturn to be just like the PlayStation, however. Licensed from Takara, Sega themselves would do the port of the game as Toshinden Remix, or Toshinden S in Japan. A new character and story mode would be added to the game in order to trump the original PS1 release. However, the PS1 version had been a graphical showpiece for the system, and the Saturn version was noticeably weaker in this area. Gone were the beautiful transparencies and light sourcing of the PS1 version, as well as far less detail in the backgrounds and weaker textures on the characters. This left only Toshinden's gameplay to shine, and unfortunately, it played just as slow and lacked just as much depth as it always had. In Sega's rush to secure this game, not once did they stop and realize that it was going to end up yet another cog in the machine of negative hype making the system look bad. It was just another game on the Saturn that clearly showed the PS1 was a more capable 3D powerhouse. Sega already had enough of those from third parties. They didn't need to add to it themselves. Toshinden's popularity would fade as time went on, and rightfully so. The game is shallow and plays poorly in the light of better games from Sega themselves. This one is cheap, however, and if you remember it fondly, grab it. The Japanese version is quite playable in its arcade mode.
No sweat.
Everyone knows how important Wipeout was to the PS1 early in its life. The game looked and ran incredibly and had a killer soundtrack. It immediately verified the PS1 was a beast and a force to be reckoned with. So naturally, I was stoked to hear that the following year, the Saturn would get a version all its own. I bought the game day one, and although it lacked much of the polish of the PS1 game, I still loved every minute of it. Both frame rate and texture work took a noticeable hit upon first viewing. The dreaded Saturn dither transparency also showed up in the weapon effects, tarnishing the game further. Not all would be lost, however, as the gameplay had been fine-tuned to be more forgiving when hitting walls, making the game more playable and less frustrating. Hitting the wall at high speed didn't mean a brutal stoppage anymore. The soundtrack was also incredible, belting out some of the finest Euro techno available at the time. Overall, the Saturn version was still a fine game and shouldn't be overlooked. Most third-party racers were terrible on the machine, and this one is definitely a standout. And heads up to importers, the Japanese version of this game is affordable and fully enjoyable to English-speaking audiences. So, 11 ports to the Sega Saturn. Out of that batch, I would recommend Gex, Wipeout, and Alien Trilogy as purchases today. All three of those games are still really playable and fun right now. The other games, if you remember them fondly, you liked them, most of them are cheap, so they won't break the bank, you can pick them up. But I really want to get you guys' opinion about these types of episodes. These episodes where I just glom in a handful of games and do quick reviews of them. Do you like the way this style of video is done? Or would you rather me pull back a little bit and focus on less games with more content review to those specific games? I'd really like to hear you guys' opinion, and as always, I greatly appreciate you watching. I'll catch you next time.